There was an idea to put together a cinematic universe of independent superhero films that would culminate in a crossover the likes of which Hollywood had never seen. In 2008, with the release of Iron Man, such a universe was realized, and 11 years later, it has closed the first era with the box office juggernaut that is Avengers Endgame. With the future of Marvel as solid as it has ever been, it seems the perfect time for me to look back on the first entry in the crossover franchise, 2012's The Avengers. It also seems appropriate that we kick off the video version of this long-running JoBlo.com column by revisiting why Joss Whedon's first Marvel feature remains one of the most overrated movies of all time. I'm Alex Mady, and welcome to the Unpopular Opinion. When my original review of The Avengers was posted 7 years ago on JoBlo.com, I was ripped to shreds in ways that only passionate fans could. 185 columns later, the reaction to my first entry still resonates. Hell, some of those commenters still bring it up to this day. You may call that stalking, but I call that passion. The great thing about the Unpopular Opinion is that it is my opinion. You may disagree with it, but that doesn't mean one of us is right and the other is wrong. The Avengers is the perfect example of that. I have no shame in saying that as the MCU has released over 24 films in the years since The Avengers, I have seen each and every one on the big screen and loved many of them dearly. The MCU has changed so much, evolving into a behemoth of creative forces melded perfectly with corporate synergy, that it gives me a hard-on just thinking about what can come next. I have no shame in saying that Avengers Endgame brought me to tears not once, not twice, but 4 distinct times. That is the power of the movies. But what Avengers Endgame did for me was trigger a rewatch of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which has changed my opinion of some films. I now think Thor: The Dark World is a much better film than I did before, and the original Iron Man may not be as good as it was when it first came out. But what remains unchanged is that Joss Whedon's The Avengers is still the weakest film in the Avengers franchise. Yep, you heard me right. I now consider The Avengers to be lesser than Age of Ultron. Now, let's pause right there. Right about now, you're probably full of rage like Bruce Banner when they run out of stretchy pants and your big green junk is hanging in the breeze, but hear me out. The technical quality level of the films, even within the MCU itself, has exponentially increased in the last 10 years, but Marvel has regularly suffered from having the same narrative structure repeat itself over and over and over again. Remember when every Marvel movie ended with a skybeam, or every Marvel movie featured everyone getting an arm chopped off? Or when every Marvel movie had to have not just one but multiple post-credit scenes? Well, all of that goes back to The Avengers, and this film didn't execute any of those very well. You may be saying, but Alex, it was the first film. How can you judge it based on what came after it? It's not fair. To all of you, I call bullshit.
Language!
As the 5th film in the MCU, if you count The Incredible Hulk, but shouldn't we just pretend that film never happened? The Avengers was lauded as one of, if not the greatest superhero movie ever made. Clearly, the bar has been raised each successive year by Marvel themselves, with DC setting their own quality benchmarks with Wonder Woman and the more Marvel-esque Aquaman and Shazam.
Amen.
But with Disney funding you, no one is going to come in and break the wheel Daenerys Targaryen style and burn the son of a bitch to the ground. What Marvel and Disney have is a well-oiled machine, and even the manufactured controversy surrounding Brie Larson and Captain Marvel cannot derail it. Even now, reflecting on what the Avengers did at the box office in 2012, I am baffled as to why everyone thought it was so great. Yeah, seeing all of those heroes share the big screen for the first time in live action was a sight to behold, but the movie really, was it all that good? Let's go back and look at some key elements of the film that just don't work, even in hindsight. Let's start with the tone of the film. Comic books, since their creation, have always been aimed at children. In recent decades, as those children have grown into adulthood, some of the comic books have grown with them. Now, your local comic shop has just as many titles aimed at teens as they do at adults. With films, comic book movies have evolved to squarely be the domain of the PG-13 superhero. Some films, like Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, straddle that line between PG-13 and R, whereas Sam Raimi's pitch-perfect Spider-Man is a bit lighter and more acceptable for younger skewing audiences. At the start of the MCU, films like Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America: The First Avenger were all PG-13, but had minimal profanity and sexual content. These were superhero films for the masses. Joss Whedon, whose experience with teen material like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, was the perfect filmmaker to usher in this combined universe. With his pop culture savvy and geek credibility, instead, Whedon delivered one of the most generically directed movies of all time. Sure, the iconic 360-degree shot from the final act is one of the most memorable moments in the MCU, but outside of that, everything about the Avengers feels mass-produced and formulaic. Thankfully, Kevin Feige has diversified the filmmaking core of the MCU and brought in the Russos, Taika Waititi, and James Gunn, who have all upped the ante on directing talent. Hell, even Kenneth friggin' Branagh did a better job on Thor than Whedon did with the Avengers. It is as if Branagh said, "Let me show you how an auteur helms a studio-controlled tentpole," to which Whedon replied, "Hold my beer." Joss Whedon has never been as strong as a director as he is a writer, but with the Avengers he split the difference and the result is beyond mediocre. In hindsight, something that is vital when it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it becomes clear that there was never any endgame in mind when the series was ultimately going, outside of something with Thanos thanks to that post-credit scene. As a diehard Lost fan, I've seen what happens when promises are made with no intention of keeping them. Granted, Marvel Studios pulled a rabbit out of their ass by finding a winning formula that got better with each successive year of movies. But with the Avengers, it was disjointed and nowhere near the quality we saw once Joe and Anthony Russo took the reins from Whedon. The narrative complexity of Avengers Endgame makes the first movie look like a puny god rather than the iconic franchise starter it should always have been. So, is it all Joss Whedon's fault that the Avengers fails to live up to the hype? Yes. Yes, it is. Every actor solidly portrays their character, with Robert Downey Jr. already locked into playing Tony Stark.
Doth mother know you weareth her drapes?
Chris Evans, Scarlett Johansson, and Samuel L. Jackson were equally up to the task, and Mark Ruffalo made an astonishing debut as Bruce Banner. Instantly becoming the best actor to ever play the Hulk, Ruffalo has grown into the part with each new film. But even with the Avengers, he was clearly born to play the role. The same cannot be said for Chris Hemsworth or Jeremy Renner, two actors who eventually became worthy of their parts but were still finding their rhythm in this film. Renner is left pissing in the wind as Whedon cannot find any worthwhile screen time for the mostly useless Avenger. Yay, I shoot arrows and mope around! Clearly, Whedon loves Hawkeye, which is why he is later shoehorned in a family subplot for him in the Age of Ultron. But here he becomes nothing more than a henchman for 2/3 of the movie. On the other hand, to be fair, Hemsworth is an excellent Thor and did a serviceable job in his solo films, but the balance of humor and strength he exhibited in Ragnarok and all of the Avengers sequels is not on screen in this film. Outside of getting sucker punched by Hulk, Hemsworth is not much more than a vehicle to bring Loki into the mix. And while Tom Hiddleston's performance as Loki was another highlight of the early MCU, he is a piss-poor villain. Sure, Loki was the first villain that the Avengers faced in the original comic books, but there is no logical explanation that gets him from Thor to the Avengers. We infer a lot, and a decade later, well, I guess it makes sense, but it took a blurb on Marvel's official website earlier this year claiming Loki was mind-controlled when he started the Battle of New York. In hindsight, seeing Loki become an anti-hero and a more likable character further undermines his arc in the Avengers, and makes the stakes of the entire film even more meaningless. Couple that with the faceless Chitauri fighting forces, and it ends up making the Battle of New York look like a superhero version of Transformers Dark of the Moon's epic Battle of Chicago. And if you compare the two side by side, Transformers clearly has the better battle. The reason we treasure the Avengers' closing fight is that 360-degree shot and the historical significance of what it means for comic book movies. Aside from that, the scene isn't really all that memorable. The Avengers offers very little in the way of a trademark style which goes back to Whedon's direction. While there is nothing wrong with workmanlike filmmaking, the Avengers rides on the characters while not really giving us anything truly iconic. Even Alan Silvestri's score isn't really anything special. After hearing the Avengers theme for a decade, it has now become part of the zeitgeist, but in the first movie it was not a rousing soundtrack like Hans Zimmer's The Dark Knight score or even Danny Elfman's for Spider-Man. What works well in the Avengers is far outweighed by what does not. With over a dozen films released in the years since it hit multiplexes, the game has changed. New does not always mean improved, but in the case of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, The Avengers is one movie that pales compared to its sequels. Bigger is not always better either, but the scale of Joss Whedon's first foray into the MCU doesn't hold a candle to what it should have been. It is one of the smallest epic films I've ever seen and truly doesn't hold up well even 7 years later. I certainly would not call it a bad movie by any means, but it absolutely is one of the weakest Marvel movies and one of the most overrated comic book movies of all time. But hey, that's just my unpopular opinion. Feel free to share yours in the comments. I'm Alex Mady with JoBlo.com.